The psychodrama probably is the psychodrama actually, because you sit there amongst people. I talked about some of the times we are shooting ourselves in the foot. It's when you see colleagues that get on with each other, know each other, that are saying things that can't be unsaid.
This is the exit interview of Paul Scully, Conservative MP for Sutton, Cheam and Worcester Parks since 2015. So, Paul Scully, welcome to your exit interview.
Lovely to be here.
First question then, why are you leaving?
Why am I leaving? So things are clearly tricky for the party, but it's not a matter of just running away from things. I was never going to retire as an MP. I didn't want to be shuffling around the Commons in my 80s. I came into it almost by accident, and I sort of like want to leave things whilst I still want more, because I still love the job. And so I think I'd win my seat if I stood again. It would be a challenge, but I think I could win it. It's more about the next 5 years, and I'm not going to be here for the long-term part of the long-term solution for the party. Best I step aside, let someone else come in who's hungry for that. Let them do that while I go on to my next stage.
You talked about how the Conservative Party had lost its way. What do you mean by that?
I think at the moment there's so much happened at the moment. A lot of that is the global situation, whether it's Brexit initially and how Parliament as a whole dealt with Brexit, and then COVID, and then the cost of living exacerbated by the Ukraine situation, and of course now with Gaza. All of those factors have come in, but then there have been avoidable mistakes that we've made as a party, which has just made it more difficult to deal with. So actually what you find now is a parliamentary party who seem to be looking for the next thing rather than the fight that's ahead of them, the general election that's ahead of them. So there's no vision at the moment. I think that's what we've got to focus on. What's the vision for the next 5 years rather than just crisis management?
Is it a party that currently deserves to win an election?
That's a really tough question until we articulate the vision. Without a vision, you can't really say so. But I mean, that vision has to come through a manifesto. So I'm not saying it doesn't, but there's a lot of work to be done to get to that point.
So let's talk about how you said you got into it by accident. How then did you end up as an MP in 2015?
So look, I voted for the referendum party in 1997. So I was challenged by my then MP, a guy called Nigel Foreman in Carshalton and Wallington, when I was saying we wanted a election on the vote on the Maastricht Treaty. He said, well, if you want that, you've got to vote for the other guy, the referendum party. So we did. Funny enough, you be careful of what you ask on the doorstep. And so I blamed myself for bringing in Tom Brake, the Lib Dem MP for Carshalton and Wallington, and for Tony Blair. And so this is almost my penance. I was that guy that joined the party in 1997, 2 weeks after the election, thinking, here's £25, you need it more than I do. And then just gradually things kicked off from there, delivering a few leaflets. I eventually became the chairman of my local association, a local councillor. And that's when the control freakery really kicked in. I think I was the best person to win my local seat. And I was never going to travel around the country to be an MP. It was my local seat.
It's interesting you wanted a referendum. Given everything's now happened with Brexit and what's happened over the last 8 years since Britain voted to leave, do you think stepping back from Britain's relationship with the EU was the right thing?
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about that whatsoever. But I was really careful when I said that my first answer, when I was talking about Parliament lost its head, because I think, we had millions of people voting to leave the EU. A lot of that was because of the relationship with the EU, but some of it was about disaffection, which you would discuss in a different forum. But actually, I think it was less to do with the decision that was taken on that day. It was the 2 years afterwards when Parliament just effectively lost its head that's actually caused some of the disconnect between us and the EU and in terms of our relationship, because you had the people that were the ultra remainers, shall we say, that actually just pretended they wanted it to go away so they could have a second referendum. You had the ultra leavers who were trying to chase a perfection that doesn't exist, who were trying to hope it goes away, so that they could have some Brexit that didn't exist. Those of us in the middle that voted to leave, like me, those that voted to remain, but actually, wanted to have the will of the people, who just wanted to get something done constructively, really got squeezed out.
So where does the blame lie there? Because it was interesting the last few weeks after it was announced she was going to stand down as an MP. There was lots of, tributes to Theresa May and her incredible public service and so on. Actually, if you look at those 3 years, she was the Prime Minister, which gives you an enormous influence over the national debate and what happens in Parliament. And actually nothing happened. And a lot of the problems you're talking about were embedded during that period. Did she bear responsibility for some of that?
Well, I'm not going to blame her, but of course she will want to. She will take responsibility for that as the Prime Minister. But I think that is unfair because it's a collective loss of head. I think from Parliament itself. At that time, over those years, anybody that was Prime Minister would have struggled to bring those, it's like herding cats kind of thing, bringing those sort of people together for the reasons that I've said. Michel Barnier, frankly, he must have just thought all his birthdays had come because he was just stepping back, his hands behind his head, thinking, you crack on and argue amongst yourselves and come to me when you've got something to talk about. So we had the deal. Theresa May's deal, I voted for that 3 times, and I said to some of the leavers, so look, if you can find a better one, if you can negotiate a better one, then great, I will have my hands up and say, yeah, good on you for sticking your guns. It's interesting that you see some of the people on the Labour side and the Dems and what have you said, well, we've got a hard Brexit, or we've got a relationship that we didn't want. Well, you could have had a better one. You could have voted for one of those deals, but actually you were sticking out for something that you knew did not exist. And so they've got to take equal blame.
Let's talk about your career then. So you got elected in 2015. You then became Minister for London in 2020. Then you've had lots of jobs all over at Whitehall. You were Minister for Tech and the Digital Economy at the Department for Science. You were Junior Minister at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. You were at Levelling Up Housing and Communities. You were at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. In those, Parliamentary Under Secretary, Ministry of State roles, what's it like being in that, listeners who know the sort of the Chris Mullin diary, he was a junior minister, essentially minister for paper clips, how he sort of characterised it. Worse than being on the back bench. What was your experience? Did you enjoy all that sort of being moved around in the lower regions of the government machine?
I really enjoyed the 4 years as minister. You have to look at it in the prism of where I was at the time. I was appointed minister a month before lockdown. So literally COVID was all I knew for 2 years. And I was sitting there on Zoom, a team call after Teams call, and other chat applications are available, and those kind of things, and doing a lot of work, thinking, crikey, this must be what it's like to be a minister. I don't think it was, actually, if you look at normal times, because since then I've done about 12 bills as primary legislation as bill minister. That works out to something like 8% of the entire government output over those few years. I did more media than a lot of ministers. There was a lot to talk about, clearly, in COVID and afterwards, and more meetings and engagement than most other ministers. So I sort of took a step back thinking, crikey, what's everyone else doing? Maybe I need to reevaluate. But of course, when you get past COVID, then you start hitting a little bit more normal times. So those first years were working with hospitality, it was working with nightclubs and personal care sector, hairdressers and the like. It was working with entrepreneurs and retailers whose businesses were either under threat or closed down. It was just real crisis, reactive stuff. But then by the time I got to tech minister, that was fantastic because you can then look at AI and semiconductors and digital skills and stuff. You're planning, strategic planning for 20 years hence, and that was really exciting.
And have you got a thing, one of the things that's come up a lot in these exit interviews is everyone's got a thing, whether it's either a backbench MP or as a minister, the thing that the Paul Scully stamp is on, that happened because you were there, whether it's a change in the law or a shift in government policy. Is there a thing that you will look back on and think, well, if nothing else, in the decade I was an MP, I did that?
It's got to be the post office. I was, whilst I was business minister, there's a lot of things that I can, hopefully think feel proud about. But I know the best thing I will ever do in politics, I knew it at the time, was start this statutory inquiry for the Horizon postmasters, the biggest miscarriage of justice in British court history, and start the compensation schemes going and reopening it for Alan Bates and the 555 postmasters that he represented. Now, I know this is clearly still going on. I know that postmasters are still struggling. And I said at the time, and I think why I was able to unlock it is just actually realizing that it wasn't a software scandal, it was a human scandal. It's the way people reacted to the failure of the software that really hurt those people and destroyed their lives. And I knew that I could say whatever I wanted in Parliament, at the dispatch box, or directly to them. It wasn't about words, it was about actions, because these people have no trust in politicians, in civil servants, in lawyers, in judges and things like that. You have to act. That's the only way they're going to be able to see results.
And where does the blame then lie for that? Is it solely at the post office? Is it the succession of post office ministers of all parties? Whose fault was it that the human reaction to the technical problem ended up with people wrong? Because computers go wrong all the time, but they don't all end with people ending up in prison.
No, exactly. Look, you've got to lay the first blame at the post office. I mean, it was their software. Fujitsu were the providers of that, and Fujitsu will answer their questions in the inquiry, as will the post office. But clearly, it was they were the ones that did the prosecuting, the post office, and so they have to take first blame. But then, yes, there were a succession of ministers afterwards, and I don't. It's difficult for me to put myself in their position, because I had the benefit of hundreds of pages of judgment by Justice Fraser of that now very well-known court case, Alan Bates's court case. The result of that I could look at, that I could see the damning evidence that was in front of me. So I wouldn't want to belie the efforts of other people. But you're right about software. We're not long. When Horizon first came in at the beginning of the century, we just had the Millennium Bug. So we knew that software goes wrong.
You talked about when you were a minister, you were often on the media, and there were some ministers, and people recognise them, the ones who come around regardless of what is in the news. I suspect most of the time when you're out doing the morning round and you're on the Today programme in Times Radio and Sky News and Good Morning Britain and all of that, you're not being asked about your brief. You're just being asked to be kicked from pillar to post about whatever was on the front pages. Tell me about that. How does that happen? How do you end up being the guy? Look, Paul, it's a tough old day out there. The polls are bad. There's scandal or, government problems all across the front page. Can you just go out and eat a sandwich again on the telly?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things there. So first of all, I think I had to have some imaginative ways of shoehorning what I was actually announcing into some totally different types of conversation. I think why journalists, came to me was because they see me as someone who engages in the question. Yes, I've got a briefing from Number 10 or from my department or whatever I'm talking about, but I try and actually answer the question somewhat naively. The media comms people would be tearing their hair out if they knew that. But I do think that's important. And actually, that was why I would say, yes, I don't want to be a renter quote or anything like that, but actually I see it as part of my job. If I'm going to be a minister, if I'm going to take collective responsibility, then I should explain myself. And I think it's really important that government does that. It comes back to the vision that I was talking at the beginning, because people don't have to like the decision you're making, but they need to understand why you are making. They don't even have to understand it. They have to understand why you are taking that decision. Then maybe they can respect it, even if they don't agree with it.
Yeah.
And so as a government minister, if I don't like what my government is doing, I resign, right? I mean, if I can't adhere to collective responsibility, I go off and do something else. Otherwise, I'll explain why I am doing what I'm doing, why I'm still there, why I believe either let's see where the evidence takes us in the case of things like Partygate and those kind of things. What I don't want to do is just react to every news cycle and say, should Boris Johnson resign? Yes or no? It's not a yes or no question. He's a prime minister. Whatever you think of him, you need to have a relatively high bar. Otherwise, the media and the opposition, importantly, will come back for the next target, the next target, the next target.
And there have been plenty of those. Occasionally, your plain speaking has got you into trouble, though. Most recently, when you claimed that parts of Tower Hamlets and Birmingham were no-go areas, which you then apologised for, and said it was a poor choice of words. Do you wish you just hadn't said it?
Yes, I do, because it actually didn't bear enough relevance to what I was actually arguing about in the first place, which was the fact that Lee Anderson's words were anti-Muslim, and that was what I was there to talk about. The reason I apologised for the choice of words is because no-go areas sort of triggers people. They define it in a particular way that I wasn't defining it in that way. What I was trying to say is that people feel uncomfortable travelling into some areas, and therefore whole communities get written off because of that prejudice, and often that prejudice is fueled by headlines based on a handful of people. Now, it might be, we see it, forget colour of skin or faith. It might be old people walking past a whole load of school kids, and they feel intimidated by them. It's that kind of unconscious bias or whatever. So it's better to explore that rather than just saying everything's rosy. Because I did have one of the news producers saying, tell you what, why don't you come into Tower Hamlets with the sitting MP, Roshan Ali, who's a good friend of mine, and so we'll walk around and find out why this is a wonderful place. Well, I know why it's a wonderful place. I spent a lot of time in Tower Hamlets. I know a lot of British Bangladeshis in particular. Better, though, surely, to spend a bit of time around the area asking people why they might feel uncomfortable travelling in. If you can't find anyone, then I'm wrong. That's fine. Yeah. If you can, tackle the prejudice, and then you get a better community as a result.
On the subject of London, former Minister for London, of course, you ran at one point to be mayoral candidate for the Conservatives in London. What have you made of the campaign for Susan Hall? I mean, it seems to have been a bit chaotic on her part to start with, and now we've got Conservative Party adverts supposedly showing chaos on the streets of London using footage of New York. Yeah, I mean, it's frustrating because, look, I think what we should do, and I've told the party this as a selection process, is you need to have a job description. What do you want your candidate to do? What do you want them to be able to achieve? It's a £20 billion a year organisation. You can't just have an open selection when you sort of like, go through a process and have someone that is like yourselves. You have to have someone that you can see as a chief exec of London. You need to run a campaign on that basis. So it's not just about trying to scare the bejesus out of people because they don't like the incumbent or something like that. Why? Because actually you've got a whole load of people investing in London. London is also vies with Bangkok and a couple of other cities for being the most visited city in the world. You put people off on that basis. So you've got to, actually a campaign on a. So these videos showing supposedly Sadiq Khan's London in the grip of gangs of goodness knows what. I mean, that's just painted. Anyone around the world can see that. It's not an experience of the vast majority of people. It's just not true. I mean, most people, there are gangs, there are areas that are, you wouldn't choose to travel to for fear. The fear of crime always is way above actual crime. But actual crime is still too high. And the mayor is the de facto police and crime commissioner, and he waves his finger at government, saying it's government's fault. He waves a finger for transport, which TfL still, has no money, at the government. And he talks about housing. It's all the government's fault. So what's the point of the mayor? So there's plenty of things to focus at the mayor and call him out. Without saying things which aren't true. Without just sort of putting out a scare video about New York. Okay, let me turn to some classic exit interview questions now then. Summing up your bosses in a word. We'll start with your first boss when you came in 2015, David Cameron. Sum up David Cameron in a word. I think transformational, in terms of the party, transformational. Do you think that transformation's been undone? Yes, for the reasons that I said at the beginning. Yeah. The fact that it's not all the Conservative Party shooting itself in the foot. There's been a good amount of that, but there's not all about that. There's been a lot happened, as I say, since that. I think any leader would have struggled to cope with. Theresa May in a word. Technocratic. She's a really nice woman. I've done a lot of work with her since actually she was Prime Minister on domestic abuse and how employers can work with that. I think she's very process driven. She's very public service driven. But I think what you need in any leader, and we politicians, Isabel Hodman's book about why you get the wrong politicians pertains here. Emotional intelligence is so important. The problem is with emotional intelligence in politics is that most of us that want to be MPs, never mind prime ministers, have a slightly stunted emotional intelligence by dint of having the ego wanting to get there. The rest of it gets beaten out of us by the selection process, the election process, and everything that follows. That's really interesting and slightly depressing. Boris Johnson in a word. Charismatic, I suppose. It would be the word. There's plenty of other things you can say. Maybe, I don't know, chaotic and these kind of things. What I saw with Boris is he is a larger-than-life figure
He is a very loyal figure. I've seen him within a week. I've seen him within a week as a naughty schoolboy being interviewed by Beth Rigby on Sky. Think about the Partygate and those kind of things, as if he was outside the headmaster's study. And then literally a few days later, when Putin invaded Ukraine, I was in a meeting with him and he was so on it. It was about 6:30 in the morning, asking all the right questions and really very, very divisive. He's a man for the big times.
I think the first time I met you was when Boris came to campaign for you in the 2015 election.
Yeah, I think we did.
I mean, I'd seen it before, but not quite to that extent. The rock star quality he had in 2015.
Oh, hugely.
It took him 2-3 hours to get from the top of the high street to the bottom of the high street.
He
just
came
stopping
a few
and
times.
peeping and selfies and all of that.
He came a few times, and we had to shrink the area that we were targeting because we knew how mobbed he was going to get. And he always used to take a load of my leaflets and hand them out and go, Scully bump, give me some more Scully bump to hand out. And people wanted to be around him and have selfies taken with him. And he does have, reach the areas that other people can't do.
Although quite a lot's happened since 2015. Liz Truss, in a word.
How do you get that? We're too fast, too soon, sort of. I don't know how to put that in a single word. In a rush. That's 3 words. That's still 3 words.
Rushing.
Rushing. There you go. Because I think with Liz, if you looked at the leadership campaign that summer, when you got to the final 2, I'd always looked for a Goldilocks character. I needed someone to put rocket boosters under Rishi, someone to pull Liz back a little bit, because Liz was right when she was talking about Treasury orthodoxy, right about sort of more dynamic modelling that you need to do in Treasury to actually look at how your policies change behaviour, not just push up a figure, push down a figure. It's not all just about single levers. But she tried to throw everything kitchen sink into a budget and run before she could walk.
So go on then, Rishi Sunak in a word.
Sort of corporate manager, I suppose. That's 2 words. So I'm getting better. But he's good. He's a good man. He's a good, genuine family man. I think he's got a good heart. I think he's wrapped up in crisis management at the moment. If it be me, and clearly, there's no way I'd ever want to be Prime Minister. If I was in this position that we're in now, over the last year, I'd have said, right, this is the single thing I want to do. It's not the 5 pledges. We need to do those anyway. But it's that's it. This is something I want to achieve to change society, to change the country. It may be something like adult social care that we've been talking about for God knows how long to sort out, but sort a problem out, because he's a really good problem solver, actually. That's what he does. That's what he did in a corporate life. That's what you can apply to politics, as long as you have that emotion that you realise that politics is also about emotion. It's about vision.
It's really interesting. Really interesting. What's some other classic exit interview questions? We talked about the thing you're most proud of and dealing with the sub-postmasters. What's the bit of the job you enjoyed the least?
The psychodrama. Probably is the psychodrama, actually, because you sit there amongst people. I talked about some of the times we are shooting ourselves in the foot. It's when you see colleagues that get on with each other, know each other, that are saying things that can't be unsaid. And you can debate, you can discuss, and the whole point about the Conservative Party, like the Labour Party, they are broad coalitions. Ken Clarke said to me when he was holding court when I was a new MP, he's saying, you know what, the reason we don't have many coalitions is that coalitions are formed before the election, not after the election. So you've got these 2 big broad church groups, but then you had first Brexit, and now you're in a similar sort of position when people are feeling entrenched in their own view, and they can't see the view of their colleagues who they were happily sharing a platform with a few years before. And that's something we've got to get back to. We've got to recover from that. And that's why the next 5 years is going to be really important for the Conservative Party.
One of the things that's come up a lot in these interviews, almost every conversation we've had, is people have talked about the impact on, there's the abuse which seems to be getting worse in the way that people treat their MPs, but also the impact that's had on their families. Well, I mean, you're in one sense lucky because you're a London MP, so you're not away for huge parts of the week. But what impact has being an MP and a minister had on you and your your life as a family?
First of all, slightly depressingly, I got divorced halfway through. So massive.
Because
massive.
of the job?
Partly. If there is it doesn't cause it. I think if there is a chink of difference in your marriage or family life or whatever, politics has a habit of just blowing that open slightly. So that didn't help.
Because that night that you could have had a chat, actually, you were a thing. You were voting. You were. It takes you apart a lot.
You have to be really focused at one thing, and that allows you to drift. So I just need to do this engagement. I just need to speak to that person. Maybe I just need to have another drink with that person. Because so much of it is about networking and social and relationship building. It's not just because we're having fun and those kind of things. So you do have to invest that time, but that comes at a cost if you don't get your balance right. I didn't get my balance right, and it's interesting you talk about being a London MP. Because part of the problem is early doors that a lot of people said, oh, at least you're a London MP, you get back home at night, which is true. But the problem is I got back to the back of my ex-wife's head because I'd be often back after midnight. And so literally, I will see you in bed, that kind of stuff. So
in a way, almost is worse than if you'd...
Yeah, because you can compartmentalize your time
Yeah.
if you're away. But at this time, you're still expected. The constituents expect a lot of you because you can get back on a Tuesday night, can't you? Whereas if you're in Yorkshire, no, I can only do Thursday or Sunday, or Monday morning, that kind of stuff. But it's interesting because you talked about the abuse now, social media abuse, and that has clearly got worse. And I fear it's going to get worse before it gets better, to be honest. And I saw a tiny little bit of it. You talked about the no-go areas where the pile-on that came on there, I was really quite shocked at, actually, because you have a lot of people that were genuinely offended by what I said. You had a lot of people saying, oh, good on you, you've just said what other people are thinking. And you had a chunk of people saying, oh, you're supporting Lee Anderson and all this kind of stuff. And when I apologised, they called me a coward. So, well, I can discount those because that's not what I was saying. But then you get a little bit of confected anger as well that are piling on top of the actual frustration and offence and those kind of things because they see it as a game. Politics is not a game because we're playing with people's emotions, people's lives. And my bit was a tiny, tiny bit. I get the Tory scum and those kind of accusations. That's water off a duck's back in many ways. But when you see some of the things that female MPs are getting, that people from an ethnic minority background and heritage are getting, I'm half Burmese, but people don't really consider that because I'm comparatively light-skinned, but we talk about Diane Abbott a lot. The kind of abuse she gets is horrendous.
Yeah. So would you recommend this job to friends, family, someone you cared about?
I think be really careful. Yes, it is an amazing job. You have amazing experiences. You can do amazing things. I came in, as I said, to my local seat. Since then, I've done amazing things on the national stage, not least post office, as I've helped cystic fibrosis sufferers get a life-changing job, or can be, free on the NHS. I've done some international stuff. Being half Burmese, I was the first MP with Will Quince and Anne Main into the Rohingya refugee camps. I saw people coming back, literally with the back of the head smashed in with a machete, which, by the way, changes your perspective on what's going on here. But I've been able to raise those issues on an international stage and those kind of things. So it's amazing. But don't do it because you're this idealistic guy that wants to, or girl that wants to just become Prime Minister tomorrow. If that's your view, do not do the job. One, it's not for you, and certainly it's not for the country, frankly.
Last question then, in your exit interview, Paul Scully, standing down as Conservative MP for Sutton, Cheam and Worcester Park. What will you do next?
That I do not know. This is the thing, because I was listening to your interview with Robin Walker, and Robin and I were speaking in the tea room with a load of other MPs, and you ask people the question when the election's going to be. You can actually see whether they say it's going to be a May or June election, now May's off the table, or an October election. Often, if you scratch the surface, it's whether they've got a job or not. So I was talking about it's confirmation bias. So I've got a few things. I'm probably going to do a few bits and bobs. I've taken on, although it's got to go through the committee, Ministerial Appointments Committee, about chairing an insurance company. But that's a small start-up. I think it's not going to pay the bills. So there's other things I'm looking at, similar, probably portfolio career.
Well, Paul, it's been great to speak to you and to get your reflections on almost a turbulent decade in politics. Paul Scully, thanks for joining us for your exit interview.
Pleasure.